Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
So hello and welcome to a special episode of a series of interviews we're doing at The Honest Critique. My guest today is someone quite an unorthodox and unusual journey. From being a condensed matter physicist who was a post-doctoral researcher at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory at the University of California, to founding the 1940s Partition Archive and being a member of the Forbes non-profit council. Thank you, Dr. Guneeta Singh Bhalla, for taking your time and being on the show.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure.
So let's start talking a little bit about your childhood days back in India. How was your childhood days, and when did you decide to move back to America?
I didn't move back to America. I was born and raised in India, so I moved to America. So I was born in Delhi. So I come from an army family. I was born at the Delhi Kent Military Hospital. And I lived in a lot of the military places. I lived in, Leh, Ladakh, in Kashmir, in Chandi Mandir, near Chandigarh, and Pune, in Delhi, and so on, until we moved to the United States when I was 10 years old. I'm guessing you probably want me to make a connect between my current career and my childhood journey. So I can tell you a little bit about, my childhood summers were all spent in Punjab, at my grandparents' place in Faridkot. And there they also have had a lot of farmland, so we spent a lot of time on the farms. And a couple of things that I learned from, being a kid there. Well, one, we lived pretty close to, the border with Pakistan was not very far. So we watched, we had two television channels at a time when in India, most people only had one. They had Doordarshan, but we got to see Doordarshan and we got to see Pakistani TV. So I grew up watching Indira Gandhi on one side and Benazir Bhutto on the other side. And so I was very aware of, these two countries. And we used to go just for fun with some of our younger mamajis who at the time were like teenagers, but we were very small children, like 4 or 5 years old. And, in those days, teenagers were allowed to drive Jeeps. So he was our 15-year-old mamaji, and he would take us to the border. And we would just go there to wave at the guards and to ask them if we can drink. I think they were drinking 7-Up or some drink, or maybe some drink that we didn't have in India. They used to drink, and we used to watch the guards drinking tea together. And so it was those kind of things we used to do. And we knew our family had come from that side. So I was very aware of this other side that I was not supposed to go to. And it was curiosity, like, okay, if we're from there, why can't we go there? The border in those days was not this elaborate place it is today. It was just a fence, and you could just see the other side. It wasn't like, this big elaborate setup that you see today with the Wagah border ceremony. And there was like a jungle near the border. So we used to go look at the really big beehives that were like 5-6 feet tall, which I have not seen, I guess, with a lot of the depletion of India's natural resources these days. The other thing I think that really shaped my desire to work on history is, in those days, even this is in the 1980s and 90s when I was a kid, we were in Punjab. They had to dig deeper and deeper wells. They were already feeling the water depletion due to the rice, growing rice and paddy, which is not natural to the area at the level at which it's being grown. And so because of this water depletion, people had to dig deeper and deeper wells. And what this meant is that the discovery of treasure, of buried treasure, was very common. People were finding ancient coins quite often in these times when they were digging these deep wells. Now, most of the time it was finders keepers. There was no government program to, get people to retrieve these interesting materials like some countries have. So people would just melt the gold, and the leftover coins that were not gold were given to my mamaji, who was a history enthusiast. No one wanted those coins, and he loved them. So he would eventually, when I grew up and moved to the United States, he would ask me to help him identify them because I had, the internet came about in the late 90s. I was a teenager then. And so I found, some of these coins and learned that they were, actually I found them from, I think there's a professor at the University of Delhi, and from her book, some of these coins were 2,000 years old. And I was just so deeply, disturbed, but also in awe that we were living on top of this incredible history, but it was not preserved. And not only that, we didn't have the sense to preserve it. We didn't have the sense of its importance. And so I always wanted to do something about that since I was a child in India. And later when I moved to the US, that belief got even stronger. But outside of the traditional academic realm, there wasn't too many things you could do with history, right? And so eventually, things kind of just one thing led to the other. And I can tell you the whole story of the archive at some point, but that was sort of the childhood connection back to how the archive, the seed of it, kind of was there.
So if you could point me to a year that you probably moved to the States?
1989.
A lot of Sikhs were moving from India post that program that happened, probably state-sponsored program. Was that one of the reasons that you moved as well?
Sorry, the Operation Blue Star?
Post Operation Blue Star, the anti-Sikh, the program that was happening around there. A lot of Sikhs moved.
Yeah, that definitely played a role in my family's decision to move. They no longer felt secure in India. My dad's brother was already in the US. He had been there. He went to college in the US, so he had just been there since then. And so we moved to be closer to him. My dad left the military at that time. And yeah, in 1984, we took a family trip to the Golden Temple after the carnage. So as a very small child, I saw the carnage. I saw what it looked like after the Operation Blue Star. So I still remember that very vividly.
And you grew up and you went as well to the Punjab, which was turbulent that time.
Yeah.
Do you have any memories from that?
Yeah. We moved to Punjab in 1986 from Pune. My mom felt we would be safer there because this is after all this stuff was happening. And so we moved to, we were living in Ludhiana. And I remember even at that time, little children who were just 5 and 6 years old, it was so like, I don't think we even understood what we were doing, but little children used to walk around and sing slogans of Khalistan Zindabad. People were like, so there was this grip of independence, people wanted to have their independence. So that was, I remember that, but those memories are a little vague. I was quite young, but I remember the kids my age and younger being really into it. And that, eventually died out over time, but it was definitely there. So communal tension was something that I grew up with. And I guess, that also plays into how the Partition Archive came about.
I'll come to this point later but still, as you mentioned about communal tension and other, the violence that was out there, how much of this actually shaped your understanding of the partition post that, the violence and the trauma that people experienced later on?
I think it definitely, I was able to kind of empathize. I was able to empathize, and it made me realize, like when I heard the stories from my grandparents, and they sounded so completely wild. But when I would tell other people when I got older, like especially in the US, that this thing had happened in India, and people wouldn't believe me. They were like, oh no. And I realized that they need to hear it directly from our grandparents. But I also really felt their pain because I saw what was happening around me, right, in the 1980s. And something like that, but much, much bigger, had already happened once, and nobody really knew about it. And how could we keep going forward and keep repeating these events over and over again, right? I realized that in order to move forward, we need to come over this problem of these divided histories. So what happens is you have these inherited histories. Every community in South Asia has their own history, and which is in a way, it's a beautiful thing. You know, it's very fascinating that we remember our histories orally going back generations. But the problem is that when there's conflict, two sides remember their histories differently. The histories are passed down differently. And what happens is that there's no reconciliation process, and there hasn't ever been one. And so in the future, these groups continue to collide, right? Because they've been taught these different histories. So what we really need to do is we need to see the other as human and try to put our feet in their shoes and experience their history, which we can do through storytelling a bit, you know, experience their history and realize that, oh, my story is not the only one. There are actually many different ways to look at this particular event, you know, especially communities that at times feel victimized and they feel like they need to do something vengeful, you know, like, you know, in terms of taking down buildings and putting up new buildings and that type of thing, which just creates more vengeance for the next generation, right? So I think that cycle needs to be broken. It's very old. The cycle is sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of years old. And until it's broken, we can't really move forward. And I feel like now in the digital age, with a confluence of so many people coming onto the same platforms, we can do that for history too. We can bring all these different histories onto the same platform and start to, you know, dissect them and understand them better.
So now, when you moved to the States, how was your experience different from that of India? Did you feel more secure over here, or a sense of belongingness that you experienced in India was somewhere not here? And probably that helped you move closer to who you are as a person and your identity, which later probably might shape you understand identities while you are covering partition stories.
Yeah, so definitely everyone's identity is shaped by their experience, right? For me, my identity is shaped by all the different places I lived in, you know, living in Ladakh, living in Kashmir, living in army cantonments, basically. That's part of my identity. And then moving to the US and, you know, being an immigrant, that's part of my identity. And then being a physicist is a huge part of my identity because I was trained in it for so long. So being a technology person and then, you know, coming here in the Silicon Valley area and, you know, pursuing basically something that's the equivalent of a tech startup, but it's not a tech startup. It's compassionate. It's not about profits. It's using tech for a different purpose. So I think, yeah, you know, that science technology side is part of my identity. So I have all these different identities because of having lived in so many places. No, I wouldn't say that. I have so many different influences in my identity, and definitely that shapes, you know, how the Partition Archive came about. I really think that if it were not for living in Silicon Valley, when you know when I did live here, I don't think this organization could have been born because this idea had been around for much longer in my mind, and I had talked to a lot of people about it in India, elsewhere in different parts of the world. But it was only after moving to the US, after moving to California and to this area, Silicon Valley, where people love to help other people bring their ideas to life. It's an area where nothing is impossible, right? You tell somebody nothing is crazy, nothing is impossible. And so people sort of really embrace new ideas. And I was able to launch it here. And then, of course, then bring it to India. And when I brought it to India, I got to experience firsthand how challenging it is to raise an organization off the ground. And how, I mean, I guess you guys must have experienced it, but how in India, it really is about who you know, and it's about, you know, connection and how, you know, powerful you are. And here it's very different. Here, anyone with an idea can start anything. There are like hardly any barriers to entry. So I think, yeah, I think being in India, a lot of people could be discouraged unless their father was like, you know, maybe a big industrialist or politician. But I think people do still persevere and make it happen. So I think, yeah, those things definitely played into it. I think being in the US definitely played into it.
I completely relate to you on that point that it's very difficult to raise any organization back here because of this one thing that you get a constant reminder that you are not one of us. Either you need to be
Yeah,
someone
yeah,
from the cycle of the vicious cycle that exists, or you need to succumb to it and be whatever they say you have to accept it. And
yeah.
we do face as well because as for the first time when we started like 3.5 years back as a independent media organization, people that time didn't understand what the subscriber based model is, uh, which US
Mm,
was really accustomed to, and people
right.
are like, why should I pay for my news? So I completely get that ideas sometimes actually do not two different places in the world have very different perception of the same idea. But
Right.
uh, what was your family's reaction, or probably uh, your friend's reaction when you decided that uh, you want to move ahead from being a physicist to go and cover stories? Like this is probably
Yes.
an Indian dream. Any Indian parents probably would want the kids to go up and live that American dream. And since you were part of the Silicon Valley, which a lot of Indians aspire to, and you decide to let it go all of to pursue something else, how was that happening?
A lot of shock and denial. Like my mother, it took her many years. I'd say it took her a good 7, 8 years before she got used to me doing something other than, physics and my other career that was going well, into doing something really strange. My father also rebelled a little bit in the beginning, but because his family is impacted by partition, he understood the importance of it. And so he helped, he helped in that, not in the Indian sense, but he helped in by like, you know, promoting it to his friends and encouraging me and giving me ideas every now and then. So a little bit here and there. Yeah, I think, you're absolutely right. Like, I think it, this kind of work definitely is not like fulfilling any parent's dream, right? So it's a little wild from the Indian sense. From in the American sense, my American friends absolutely loved it and embraced it. And in fact, they are the ones who encouraged me, who, whenever I was, because I ran out of money in the beginning doing this work, because this work had no money in it. There was like nobody who wanted to donate in the beginning because it was so different. So, yeah, my friends helped me. They helped me out financially. They helped me out with other things that I needed. They even made the early donations, even though they were small. My friends are not like super rich or anything. Um, so I think it was really with the support of my American friends, where this kind of idea is a little bit radical, but it's really accepted in that generation of Americans, especially. Um, and so I did get a lot of support from them.
And did you have that moment that stirred you to actually move away from this, like a particular moment, or was
Uh,
it
Sorry, a
like
moment that,
in the sense of what made you cover stories of partition? Like I understand, as you mentioned, that your father's side of the family was affected by the partition. But was there any particular story that you came across and that made you believe that you should go and collect stories like this, something like this?
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, I had heard my grandmother's story in detail when I was a teenager, and it was always there in the back of my mind. And also, there was this incident in my high school where we studied Indian history, and it was literally just one line in our global history class, like, oh, Gandhi led a peaceful march, the British left, and everything was fine. It was like this very peaceful transfer of power. And I was like, oh my gosh, they've covered up what actually happened. It was not peaceful. It was a very bloody transition of power. There was nothing peaceful about it. And so I think when they say peaceful, they mean the British left without much damage to themselves. And the people they left behind were sort of killing each other. And because of systems failure, because of the poor transition in power. So all of that was in the back of my mind, and I knew I wanted to do something. Like there's something needed to be done to bring out this true story of partition, to bridge the gap between official and folk history. And I didn't really know what until 2008, when I was actually doing a part of my PhD research in Japan, in Tokyo, and I took a trip down to Hiroshima. And in Hiroshima, I was very moved by their oral testimony archives. Hearing the stories directly of, the bomb dropping from the witnesses of Hiroshima was extremely powerful. And it made me realize that what we needed to do, it was a really huge aha moment. And after that, the momentum that I got in that moment was just unstoppable. Like nothing could stop me after that. That's when I realized, wow, we need to do storytelling. At the time, I did not know about the field of oral history. That's essentially what it was. That we needed to bring out these stories directly of the people who witnessed this event. We need them to tell their own stories. That's the only way that it could impact other people, because when people speak their truth, it shows up not only in their words, it shows up in their body language, it shows up in their expression, in their tone, and that truth cannot be denied, It's like multiple confirmations on multiple levels of communication. And so it ignites research, it ignites so much more reflection. And I felt like that was the seed that was going to help us start to think about our, divided history and to try to overcome it.
So around 15 million people were affected directly or indirectly, and over 2 million people actually lost their life between the two sides of the active line. But I think it was not an easy job as well to find these people and record the stories initially, right?
Actually, it was very easy initially. So here in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, I started going to gurdwaras and mosques and mandirs. And I would just literally put a table there with a sign, 1947 stories, and lots of people would line up. So I realized, wow, there's a need in the community to tell this story.
So, and a lot of people might be, when you started recording the stories, and how was the first experience? Were people comfortable with sharing the stories, or was that a still invisible layer of peace or distance that they were maintaining of sharing their personal stories?
There was an eagerness. There was an eagerness to share. But a lot of times people would self-censor some parts of the story. And then when you turned off the camera, they would tell you about the murders that they committed and so on. And they would justify why they did it.
And in fact, I remember this because when I was recording some stories for the 1984 violence that happened in Delhi, I remember because a lot of families used to do the same. And the reason is because as storytellers that leave certain details which might seem vague to them or not like worthy of mentioning might affect the way you tell the stories. So you how you trying to get out the stories because you're a trained physicist, right? You weren't trained in that field. So human interactions.
So actually, I think, being an oral historian, what I've recognized is that some of the best oral historians don't necessarily, I think it's an innate ability to connect with somebody. I think your ability to get someone to tell their story and to ask things in a certain way and it's all about your ability to make that connection with someone. And I don't think you need to be a trained historian to do that necessarily. I think it depends on your interpersonal skills. And that's why I felt that, documenting oral histories was not something that can be limited by your official, whatever you studied. In fact, I don't really like that in our modern world, we have divided up our education into subject matters, because I don't want to be just a physicist. I don't necessarily agree that you need to be right brain, left brain. I feel like you can be a holistic person, and have multiple skill sets that span a lot of different areas. And now, of course, my belief has been confirmed. We now know oral history to be a field which draws practitioners from all kinds of backgrounds. it really is about your ability to connect with somebody.
And so this is something that I wanted to know, that you've covered stories from different communities. So probably when you go and cover the story from I'm just giving an example from a Sikh community, probably you being a Sikh they might feel that uh, I you can confide the story because of the identity that comes in. But was there an outsider feeling when you go and cover stories from communities which did not speak your language or understand how you behave, or how why you want to do this, the way you spoke? Did it maybe feel there's this us versus them difference?
Yeah, so here's the thing. Because I grew up as an outsider pretty much my whole life with all the moving around in the military and everywhere I've lived, um, for me, I've never felt like I belong to one community, even though yes, my heritage background is Sikh, but I never felt like, oh, I just belong to one community. I've always felt like I kind of belong to the earth because I've lived in Japan, in the US, all over India, and so I never really felt like I have this one place or one group of people. And so yeah, that did happen. I remember, in fact, I had completely didn't even realize that that kind of thing could happen, because in the US, in my generation and education, we were taught to not judge based on ethnicity and background and all of this. So it was kind of a big culture shock for me when I started working on partition oral histories that, for example, the first time I documented an oral history from somebody who was Sindhi or somebody who was from Hyderabad and had migrated to Pakistan, their first questions always like shocked me. It was just like, so why do you want to do this? You're a Punjabi Sikh. And I was like, oh, wow, I never really thought of myself as that way. Yeah, that is in the Indian context, that is what I am. But I was just like, oh, well, no, I never really thought that that was supposed to be a barrier. So maybe that naiveness or that, having grown up in so many different places really helped me not get caught up in that. So when people did have that reaction, maybe because I didn't react back to them, they were not, it didn't, we didn't get carried away with it. And it was no problem eventually when they realized that it's like not a thing with me and I don't really get it. Maybe they realized, okay, she doesn't really know what we mean by that. So, but eventually over time, and especially after living in India, people make it very clear to you, who your what your background is, where you're from, and all these things. They put you in a box. And I realized that after living in India for the last 10 years, I've been living there on and off with this work. So that's when I learned all of these things.
So I want to know, like, how was your initial days at the Partition Archive? How did you start, and how did it become a fully functioning organization as a study?
Yeah. So, my gosh, we started, I was still working at, Berkeley Lab at the University of California in Berkeley at a lab. And I started doing this. I felt like the people who knew these stories were dying. This is 10 years ago. And I started doing this on the weekends and evenings. And I was doing this pretty much all the time. And it started to get so consuming. It started to consume my work time as well. And the kind of work that we have and Berkeley Lab, you need to be very intensely engaged. If you're not, you're going to fail at it because the competition is very intense. And so I started to not do as good on that work because I was working so much on the Partition Archive. And it became clear at some point that I'll need to quit that work and do this full time.
Yeah, and how was the initial days? How did you you were working in a lab, so probably the equipment that you need for recording the story won't be there with you. Like you might have a camera, but you won't have like 4 or 5 cameras at the store. But I think no one has 4 or 5 cameras just to go and record stories. So how was your starting days?
Yeah. So what we did is, at first, the first time that I recorded stories in the Bay Area, I showed up at a random temple, at a gurdwara, and I put a table and a sign there outside. They let me do that, the management, and it said, 1947 stories, and like 30 different people lined up, and I realized in that moment, whoa, there's no way I can do this on my own. So that's when I started recruiting people in student clubs. I started writing to student clubs and saying, can I give a talk at your club meeting? So that way I gave talks at a number of club meetings, and a whole bunch of people joined me as volunteers. So we started volunteering to do this together. And then eventually I had one video camera. I was an enthusiast. I loved making films. It was a big one, huge one, and I used to carry it around. And so I had that camera, and I started letting people borrow it. And then we went to different departments at Berkeley and said, hey, do you guys have cameras lying around? Can you let us borrow them? So in that way, we started borrowing cameras. And then what happened is my house turned into this like library of cameras that people were checking out. So we had all these borrowed cameras, and people kept coming over, taking a camera, leaving, getting it filmed, then bringing it over. And then we had these like hundreds and hundreds of these mini DV cassette tapes. And, you know, being a tech person that I was keeping my computers running all night, like transferring them into, I guess it was movie files, converting them into digital movie files. And so it was technologically very time consuming. And we had to put a lot of work in the early days. It was not like you just turn on your phone and you're recording and then you have like Wi-Fi and boop, you can like put your video on another device. You can go through the cloud. No, there was none of that, right? 10 years ago. So we were doing it all very manual, and it was very intense. We put in a lot of work, didn't get much sleep. I used to skip at least 1 or 2 nights of sleep every week. I can't do that anymore, but back then it was like normal for me. I had the energy at that time. But I guess that's what it takes to start up something, you know, where you need to have this impact, and you need to, you know, record so many people's stories. So yeah, it was very intensive. And then we also applied for and got into the UC Berkeley Skydeck. It was a startup accelerator. We were the first nonprofit that they accepted, and the last one, because they didn't know how to help us. But basically they gave us space, and that was really helpful. I learned a lot because it was more mentoring for for-profit, like tech startups. Some of them have gone on to become like pretty awesome tech startups. But it was good to be in that environment because it really taught me a lot of really interesting skills. This is from the early days, you know, when the startup boom was happening like 10 years ago. Yeah, and then, you know, we started recruiting people then to join us. First, it was in the Bay Area. So it was just on the university campus. Then those of us from the universities, we started putting up flyers all over the Bay Area in different Indian stores and Desi stores. And we built up our team from there. And then we started to post on Facebook. We started a Facebook page and we started posting there. And slowly people from around the world started joining us. And so far now, to these oral history trainings, we've trained over 7,000 people in how to record oral histories through our bi-monthly workshops.
And how many stories is of now? Over 10,000?
We're almost at 10,000. We slowed down a lot due to the pandemic because our oral historians couldn't go out. And a lot of elderly people don't want to have their story recorded over online video. We've tried, but most of them refuse. So, but we do as many as we can online.
Yeah. So I know it's a very, very difficult thing for you if I ask you this, but over those 10,000 stories, any story that has touched you personally or any personal experience?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it is very hard because I personally have recorded about 120 stories of those 10,000. And that's, I mean, compared to, you know, some people have done a lot more than me. So even those 120, you know, I can't think of, it's really hard to pick apart like the favorite or best because every story touches you in a different manner. And every time you make that connection, it's like equally as beautiful, you know, with somebody. But I can talk about one story in particular that kind of blew my mind. But since then, you know, I've met many people who are in that position. It was the first time I met somebody who had been orphaned by the partition, who had seen their parents get killed. And then that person had a pretty rough life, and he had migrated from Ludhiana district over to this district in Kasur in Pakistan. And then he hitchhiked after he graduated high school from Pakistan. He hitchhiked all the way to London. Took him like 6 months through the Middle East. And it was just so fascinating. And he eventually, going from this like orphan who wasn't really cared about, he eventually made a really good life for himself. He started, a small shop in London, which grew. Eventually he moved to California. Now he has a lot of different shops and businesses, and he has a really big house with beautiful grandchildren. So his life really kind of turned. And what was interesting is around the same time, I had interviewed somebody who was from his neighboring village in Ludhiana district. That man remembered the massacre. So it was really amazing for the two of them to meet, because for for Mr. Ali, the person that I had interviewed who had moved to Kasur, the orphan, for him it was like, oh wow, so that's what was happening, because he was very young.
And for we have a lot of young people watching this. So, and probably they are very distanced from the memories or the emotions of partition for sure, because they've grown up in a very secure environment at the moment, uh, from India and Pakistan both. So, why should young people be studying partition?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. One, the effects of it are still playing out. They're playing out in the way our government is structured. They're playing out in the fact that we have one of the world's most heavily militarized zones, and everybody's tax dollars are, tax rupees are paying for it. It's also generational trauma. A lot of who we are and what we are is passed down one generation to the next, and the imprint of partition on there is huge. And finally, there's a lot of important lessons to be learned in India and Pakistan and around the world about what can happen, when you get extreme polarization in society. And that's what happened at the time of partition. You had extreme polarization. You had a lot of leaders getting up, local leaders and other bigger leaders, who used to use very extreme language, and how that polarized a lot of militias. These militias are the ones that started causing the damage before it became really big, and young boys everywhere started getting involved. But it can go really out of control, and we're seeing elements of that right now in India. So I think it's still very much alive, and ignoring it is ignoring a past, a piece of the puzzle of who we are and why we are what we are, and never understanding it, and then not being able to move forward in a more mature manner. Once you resolve this big wound that we have in our history, we'll be able to move forward, I think, in a more resolved and mature manner, and we can grow into the modern world. Right now, there's a lot of ideological talk that's still going on, and a lot of it's rooted, in the past. And I think until we can grow past it, we're going to remain stuck in a place where you're not evolving politically, you're maybe devolving, and socially. That has huge social repercussions. And that's going to have repercussions on your education and your, work, being able to work later, because political repercussions play out in different ways in the economy as well.
A slightly political question in context. So when you see something back in India, when something like the Farm Bill is passed, or something like the Citizen Movement Act is passed, does that ring that bell back to partition, that it's the same thing, it's some form or the other, it's coming back?
Well, yeah, so I wouldn't say the Farm Bill is the same thing as partition, but it's definitely related. It's definitely related. Decisions that were made back then, and how it all played out, and how certain maybe promises weren't kept, and it's definitely related. And instead of saying too much here, I would encourage you guys to study it deeply. It's not what it appears to be from the news. If you hear most of the news, the news, they're just kind of demonizing each other and trying to make one guy look bad and the other guy look good. The story is much deeper. So dig deep, read critical work, and learn from that. Learn from the experts. Go ask the farmers. That's the best thing you can do.
We actually recorded like a 2 hour long audio documentaries in two parts. It's available, and we covered it from the ground. And we interviewed people. A lot of doctors flew down from US. A lot of other people from the neighboring villages came down to help. A lot of women were there, so we interviewed as many people as we could. And it was
amazing.
It was one of the most profound experience we had on ground covering stories. Uh, people who might be interested can go and watch that as well. So I have a couple of last questions. So one of them is about as a young child, as a young Indian child, when you're growing up, and you mentioned about like you exposed to two different news channels, television channels that time. A lot of Indians who grew up during that period, and especially now as well, when we look at and I have seen this that when you utter the word India as Indians, there's a sense of familiarity that comes into the picture. When you utter the word Pakistan, it's silence, pause, and thought about something which is unknown. The curiosity comes in. Uh, but when you recorded the stories and got to know about these people who were together at one given point of time, not divided with time, does that unfamiliar experience of the two words change somewhat for you?
Like as in the world before partition and after partition.
The world before you started covering partition, your world of understanding things related to India and Pakistan, or probably even the word mere uttering of the word India or Pakistan, the way it rings bells for both of the situations. Did it change after covering?
Oh, like my interpretation of the
Yeah,
situation?
yeah.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. So many of my personal beliefs were really shattered. My things that maybe I had learned in school or things that I learned in society were shattered by what I heard. First of all, I have yet to hear a story where somebody who was an adult at the time of partition has this level of hate for the other group. It's because things are much more cosmopolitan. And one thing that really shocked me that I wasn't expecting is that most people we've interviewed, maybe 99% even, maybe 99 out of 100, preferred pre-partition life over post-partition life. They said there was more law and order. There was, there is more cosmopolitan, the society. So I think there are some interesting things to learn from that. Like, what are some of the things that we've lost that we can now bring back? But yeah, my worldview has changed a lot. And also, the fact that the similarities and the fact that how much of India and Pakistan, the population exchange, how pretty much the same the populations really are. Of course, all of that sank in much, much more after I started working with more Pakistanis and more people from other parts of India. So it also made South Asia a much smaller place. I got to learn about so many cultures, and it removed a lot of the myths. And a lot of these myths, we keep hearing politicians repeat them today on like major news channels because they don't know any better. They're also uneducated. But what we need to do going forward is to learn from what we know from these stories and so on, and the kind of stories you're collecting, and teach the next generation so that they stop, living in a mythological world.
Yeah. In fact, I was having this. I asked the same question to Anand Zakaria, who's also an oral historian, and she covered stories from partition. And she mentioned that half of the students in her class haven't even spoken to an Indian. And
Yeah.
the time that she decided to have a FaceTime with Indian students and let them interact, it changed a lot of their worldview as well.
Yeah.
So, in a similar note, how does the stories that you're recording can change someone else's perspective? Are you making this public?
Yeah, so I think the way it could change someone's perspective is, when you hear someone tell their story, there's a lot that happens in our brain. We start to empathize with that person. We start to try to see the world through their perspective. And I think it can create a lot of empathy. I mean, we had a couple of people who've joined our project who've come in with very strong political views, very like hard leaning, either leaning left or right, whatever, but very strong political views. And once they started documenting enough stories, their views melted away. They realized once they made connections with people like, hey, what I thought was the reality, it's actually much more nuanced. And I need to have an open mind, and I need to hear many different perspectives. So I think the stories do have the power to do that.
Yeah. So, okay, so this is probably the last question I will ask you. So, during this time of the pandemic, the second wave, uh, I saw the archive is actually working in providing COVID relief to a lot of people. So
Yeah.
could you just tell how? And I think you also worked. I think I saw one of the stories that you tabulated the trace of COVID data last year, right?
Yeah.
Using an application.
Right. So last year, what we did, and in fact, that's offline now. It's a very long story. I'll tell you about it sometime. But basically, what we did is we used this concept of crowdsourcing oral history. And last April, we launched an app to crowdsource symptoms data at the time. But eventually, what happened is this is actually so interesting that you might even find it to be unbelievable. But we recruited a professor from Carnegie Mellon University. I haven't really talked about this ever before, outside of our group of friends, and to work on the project with us because he did a lot of modeling on pandemics before, and we wanted to do modeling with the data that we got. So we contacted him. He wasn't interested in working with us, but he let us use his AWS storage. But then what he did is he went and pitched this exact project that we were working on to Mark Zuckerberg on Facebook. And so around the time that we were launching, Facebook launched a much better version than ours because they're very wealthy, huge corporation. The only thing, of course, was that sorry, I thought I lost you for a second. The only thing was that Facebook, ours was open source data and crowdsourced. So not only was it crowdsourced, but anyone could see the data. Facebook's data is just going into, to Facebook and going to Carnegie Mellon University, to this professor, actually, the one who we had pitched this to. So it's not public, it's not a public data project like we had intended. So we've thought about starting it back up now as the pandemic is getting bad again, right now. I'm not sure if we will have the resources to do that, but I think it could make a huge difference. What we're doing right now is the archive, through the Partition Archive, is we have 53 team members who are volunteering. And we really wanted to do something. So what they're doing right now is the first thing we did was we gathered a number of fundraisers that were going on about 2.5, 3 weeks ago, and tried to address the oxygen shortage, tried to get a lot of people to donate. So we recruited donors to fund, resources in India. And now what we're doing is our volunteers have identified that there's a dearth of knowledge on public health in India. So we're bringing on mental health and other medical experts to answer people's questions through live online events. And we did a pilot of 4 events last week. And we're taking a 1-week break to organize the 53 people in a meaningful way, because it's a lot of people to organize. So we're pretty much organized, and we're going to relaunch next week in a much more serious way. So we'll continue doing that for a few weeks to maybe a couple of months, during this huge second wave in India and other parts of the world, alongside our regular programming.
Yeah. So I'll end this with one thing, that when you go and record any story or go and talk to any people, there's probably a flood of emotion that comes from the other end. And a lot of times there's this sense that they want to tell you a story fast before it disappears into the piece of forgetting or something. Uh, what are the distinct emotions that you generally find while you record a story? One, and the second part is, what's one lesson that taught you while you recorded the story, that you carry forward in other fields of your work?
Yeah, so I think emotions, I would say like every kind of emotion, right, comes out. As somebody's recalling their life story, there's going to be a lot of joy, there's going to be a lot of happy emotions, and there's going to be a lot of pain, during the painful times, especially if they experienced violence during partition or other painful memories. So you get the full range of emotions. In terms of the lessons that it's taught me, for my life, it's more of listening, to stop and listen to other people, to really understand and not judge. I can't say that I am good enough to always put those lessons in action. There's many times where you're reactionary human, flawed reactionary human, but when you can be conscious about it, I think, trying to understand that there's different perspectives and different people with different, perspectives and views and different challenges that they've had, different circumstances that have shaped them. So I've never really had any issue with meeting people from different cultures and interacting and mingling. And I don't really hold those same prejudices that a lot of people will have about, like, oh, these kind of people are like this, because I guess I didn't grow up that way, one. And second, the more stories you listen to from people, the more you learn to empathize with all kinds of people. That everybody's human, and there really is no one correct way of being human, right?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful note to end the conversation. Thank you so much once again for taking the time and being on the show.
Of course. Thank you for having me.